Hello everyone, back to tuning in to today's first video. So doing the fourth update for autumn 2020 for this update. So we're going to go through some more analogues. This time we're going to be looking at June data. We're going to be looking at the England and Wales precipitation for June 2020 and looking at years that had a similar June England and Wales precipitation and the autumns that followed those years. So I'll explain all in a moment. Follows on from last week when we looked at June's central England temperature. Of course, we're going to be releasing the GavsWeatherVids Autumn Forecast on Sunday the 30th of August. So we're still some way off from it, but it will be starting to get a little bit closer soon, and yeah, so all of these updates that we do on a week-by-week basis are building up a picture for the autumn forecast to be released at the end of August. So I'll get on with that for you very shortly. Just to say that coming up later on today, going to have GavsWeatherVids Sunday Roundup, whereas on a Sunday you're a eclectic mix of this and that. And they're going to be live streaming from 6 o'clock tonight. We're going to be looking within that live stream. Of course, we're doing taking a lot of questions and so on. But within that live stream, we are going to be looking at Peng's analogues for the winter of 2020-21. So eagerly awaiting, I think, to see what Peng is forecasting this month for the coming winter. So that will be in our live stream from 6 o'clock this evening. I'm not going to be an autumn update next week. I'm taking this week off, so I won't be getting any analogues together in the week this week. So after this update, but the next autumn update will be in a couple of weeks' time. Got to say a big thank you to our good friend Richard Trott for the autumn updates gift that we see here. Thanks so much, Richard, for that, and also to Terry Scully this week, who has helped a lot in getting these analogue years together. So a big thanks to Richard and to Terry. Okay, let's get on with it then. We're going to start off, of course, explaining what happened with June's England and Wales precipitation. So this is the England and Wales precipitation index. Goes all the way back to 1766, a very, very long-standing index that we have here at UK Met. So if we scroll down all of the years of decades, we come to 2020 down here at the bottom, and just here we find that June 2020 had an England and Wales precipitation rainfall of 98.0 millimetres. 98 millimetres was the England and Wales average precipitation for June 2020. Much wetter than May. Look how dry May was at 10.3, just 10.3 millimetres, but a much wetter June compared to May. And so what we're going to be doing for this update is looking at autumns following Junes that have an England and Wales precipitation range, or rainfall range, of 86 to 110 millimetres. And that places June 2020 right slap bang in the middle of that range. So our first autumn following a June with an England and Wales rainfall or precipitation range of 86 to 110 millimetres is the autumn of 1836, and this one is a very unsettled autumn with a deep trough of below average height centred over top of the country and to our east as well. High pressure is up to the north and winds are coming in from an east to northeasterly direction. So cool and wet, really, or even cold and wet perhaps, for the autumn of 1836. The next autumn following a June England and Wales precipitation range of 86 to 110 millimetres is the autumn of 1853, and this one is much more anticyclonic with above average height centred over and to the east of the country as well. Winds are coming in from an easterly direction, so it's a drier autumn, obviously, that, but could be rather cold, especially late on. Remember, autumn is a transitional season, so you've got a Scandinavian high and easterly winds in September. It's going to be relatively warm, but if you've got a Scandinavian high and easterly winds in November, then that could be much colder, of course. Our next autumn following a June England and Wales precipitation range of 86 to 110 millimetres is the autumn of 1863. This one is really wet. Look at this deep trough of low pressure centred over top of the country. So all that's going on with this autumn is that we're having copious amounts of rain thrown at us with areas of low pressure from the Atlantic. Next up, we've got the autumn of 1866. This one is more anticyclonic, with above average heights extending through the west of Europe up to the north. Low pressure is out to our west. Jet stream and flow is doing something a little bit like that. So obviously that's a much more anticyclonic autumn. Probably relatively warm early on, could be getting colder though later. The next autumn is 1872. We're back to low pressure for this one. So, so far, no trend really swinging between high pressure and low pressure dominated autumns. This one is a very, very low pressure dominated autumn with a deep low, deep trough covering all of northern and western Europe. The Flammer Jet's doing something like that. Copious amounts of rain again in the autumn of 1872. Really, really wet autumn. Next up, we've got 1875. This looks like our first genuinely cold autumn, potentially, with a lot of high pressure up towards Greenland and Iceland. Northern blocking is up there. And then we've got low pressure centered across much of western and central and southern Europe too. The Flammer Jet going something like that. So on the cold side of a jet stream there. And yeah, so that looks cold, blocked, possibly quite a wintry autumn in 1875. Then we have 1882. We're back to much more Atlantic-driven type weather. Very little northern blocking. Low pressure just coming in off the Atlantic. This looks like a mire, but also quite a wet autumn again in 1882. Long gap then through to 1907. So the next time we have a June with an England and Wales precipitation range of 86 to 110 millimetres is June 1907. The autumn of 1907 is looking like this, with above average heights to our north and to our northeast as well. Below average heights to our south. Winds are coming in from the east. Now this is setting up a pattern that does become very cold by the time we get through to December of 1907. It's a classic white Christmas in December 1907. And this is sort of setting up that pattern. So there are sort of indications of what's going to happen. But this autumn is relatively dry, but also quite cool, quite cold, especially later on as we get closer to that December pattern. Then we go through to 1927, so another pretty long gap, really, a 20-year gap through to the autumn of 1927. Again, remember, this autumn is following a June with an England and Wales precipitation range of 86 to 110 millimetres. This one is a very unsettled autumn, with below average heights to our east and also to our north as well, and winds are coming in from the north to northeast. Now, I gave you some wrong information there in that last analogue. So 907 is in fact not followed by a white Christmas and a cold December. It is actually 1927 that is followed by a white Christmas and a cold December. So again, possibly setting up the pattern though, with above average heights up towards Greenland and below average heights over and to the northeast again. So it is setting up like a coldy sort of pattern. It does look like quite a cold and unsettled autumn in 1927. And of course, it is then followed by that cold December and classic white Christmas that I wrongly referred to as occurring after the autumn of 1907. Sorry about that. It's been a very, very long day today. Next up, we've got the autumn of 1928. This one looks like a very wet autumn. It's preceding a cold winter too for 1928, 1929. This one just looks like a very, very wet autumn indeed, with low pressure driving in from off the Atlantic. There's a bit of blocking up towards Green. It's not a particularly cold autumn though, I don't think. Not a great deal of indication about what's going to happen in the winter to come of 28, 29. Just a very wet and unsettled autumn in 1928. 1931 is much more anticyclonic. This is the autumn of 1931, showing high pressure centre pretty much over top of the country. Lower pressure is out to the north-west. Low pressure is out towards the northwest, up towards Greenland in the North Atlantic. The Flammer Jet is doing something a little bit like that. Then we move through to 1935, and again we've got a deep area of low pressure centred over top of the country, so this one is also looking like a very, very wet autumn indeed in the autumn of 1939. Very little more to say about it, just deep low pressure centred over UK and much of Northern Europe too. 1936 is showing up as our next analogue year, with above average heights out to our northwest, below average heights are sort of to our east and southeast. The flow and the jet is doing something a little bit like that. This is a quieter autumn with more in way of high pressure out to our west and to our northwest too. Next up we have 1948, setting up high pressure to our south, and low pressure is up to the north. This is a warmer, drier autumn. We're on the warm side of the jet stream with that one. Still pretty dry. High pressure's over to the south of the country. Jet stream is pushed northwards, so a lot of dry but also mild weather in the autumn of 1948. Autumn of 1954 is next, following a June England and Wales precipitation range of 86 to 110 millimetres. This one has low pressure to our north, and we're bringing in those westerly winds too. So obviously that's a wet and unsettled, but also mild autumn in 1954. And then we've got 1966 showing up next, with above average heights pulled out into the middle of the North Atlantic, below average heights over much of northern and western Europe. This is a very unsettled and very wet autumn in 1966, with the flow and the jet doing something like that. I've talked about this autumn before. It was a very wet summer. It's a very wet autumn too. And it does culminate in the Aberfan disaster in October of 1966, where unfortunately there was a mudslide that fell on top of a school, and some children did lose their lives in that disaster. So a very, very wet autumn in 1966, following a wet summer. Autumn 1968 turns up next. This one has higher pressure to our northeast, to the north-northeast. Lower pressure is to the west-southwest. Has quite a wet spell in September of 1968. Otherwise, it's quite a warm autumn, I think. We're generally bringing up quite warm winds from a southerly direction. But it also is a little bit unsettled, especially so in September of 1968. 1985 is our next autumn, and this one has higher pressure centred over top of the coast. So this is a much more anticyclonic autumn with a fair amount of dry weather that's going to be included in this autumn. Right, so autumn 1985 is high pressure dominated with a big ridge sitting across the west of Europe. Very interesting autumn. Has a very, very warm and dry pattern through most of September and October. And then suddenly November 1985 gets really, really cold, and we drag in bitterly cold easterly winds during the autumn or during November of 1985. And then we have 1987, and this is also a very interesting autumn because, of course, it contains the classic Michael Fish hurricane moment. It is generally a wet autumn overall, lots of low pressure in the Atlantic driving in those westerly winds. So it's a wet autumn. The rain begins early on. It continues throughout most of the autumn, really, in an unsettled note. Generally a mild autumn, generally with mild air being brought in from the Atlantic. But of course, the main talking point about the autumn 1987 is the storm on the night of the 15th to the 16th of October that did bring hurricane force winds. But Mr. Fish was correct to say that we wasn't going to have a hurricane. We can't have a hurricane in our part of the world because, you know, the ocean temperatures are too cold to sustain hurricanes. But it did have hurricane force winds. Right, next up is 1991, the autumn of 1991, following a June England and Wales precipitation range of 86 to 110 millimetres. This one is another quite unsettled autumn, actually, though nowhere near as interesting as 1987. Just generally a bit mixed. It has a warm, dry September, though, and then it gradually starts turning more unsettled. But overall, quite, other than September, which was an extension of summer that year, otherwise an autumn to forget, really, in 1991. We've got 1999 as our next analogue year. The autumn of 1999 is a very, very warm autumn, particularly so in September. Has a very, very hot September, which at the time was the warmest since 1949, warmest for 50 years. Of course, it was then superseded by more recent September, such as 2006, for example. But at the time, it was a really, really warm September, particularly so in the first half of the month. Then the second half of September gets a lot wetter. This one draws up winds from like a southerly southeasterly direction. So yes, this is a very warm September and a very warm autumn overall, really, with above average temperatures. I think in all three of the autumn months. It is a relatively dryish autumn, but it is warm. And then finally, we've got the autumn of 2017. Again, this is our last autumn following an England and Wales June precipitation range of 86 to 110 millimetres. This one has above average heights out to our west, and also some blocking up to the north, with below average heights to the northeast. It's very nearly a cold of an average autumn. I don't think it quite makes it as a cold of an average autumn because it has quite a warm October. And of course, it does also contain that very, very dramatic day in October 2017 when we brought in the remains of Hurricane Ophelia. And we turned the sky sort of a blood red Martian orange colour. I'm sure everybody remembers that. It was only a couple of years ago, and it was one of the most extraordinary days in terms of the colour of the sky that we've ever had. I think in the UK, turning a Martian orange with the remains of Hurricane Ophelia. And that brought a lot of warm, humid air with it. I think overall October of 2017 was quite warmish, but September and November were cooler. And so we didn't quite come away with a cold of an average autumn, I don't think, but we wasn't far from it. It was a cooler autumn than we've had for a little while, anyway. And also relatively dry too. It wasn't a particularly wet autumn, though September was a bit on the wet side. Right, putting all of that together, this is how all Septembers combined are looking. Following a June with an England and Wales rainfall range of 86 to 110 millimetres. And look at this, overall it is a very unsettled signal for September, which is quite unusual for September, because we tend to think of September as like an extension of summer, but these Septembers, in this particular analogues package, look really wet, with low pressure driving in off the Atlantic, and yeah, just the Atlantic properly unleashed with those Septembers. So September favoured to be a significantly low pressure dominated and wetter than average month. All Octobers combined look like this. So we tend to increase the northern blocking signal in the Octobers. Low pressure tends to sink southwards. High pressure sets up to our north. This is a drier signal, of course, with the jet stream and the lows being pushed southwards. It is also potentially a colder signal, though. So maybe quite a coolish sort of signal for the Octobers, but also drier, not as wet as the September signal. And then the Novembers look like that. This is all Novembers combined from our analogues package this week. And just generally very unsettled, really, for the Novembers, with low pressure sort of driving in off the Atlantic into west of Europe. Not a particularly cold signal either. It is high pressure away to the northeast, but a very, very long way to us, like to western Russia, not in a position to do anything cold with us, really. So just a wet, mild sort of signal, I think, for the Novembers. And then all autumns combined, following a June England and Wales precipitation range of 86 to 110 millimetres, is looking like that. And it is a wet signal for these autumns, so not a surprise really, given what we've just been looking at with September and November. Deep low pressure covering much of Western Europe, so yes, very, very unsettled and wet signal for these autumns overall. Finally, if we just narrow things down and have a look at the years post 1950, So it makes very little difference for all Septembers combined. So this is taking out all of the years before 1950 and just looking at the more modern years, really. That does encompass like the warmer climate, I suppose, that we have entered, particularly in the last 30 years. So this just has the years from 1954, 1966, 1968, 1985, 1987, 1991, 1999, and 2017. Despite that, despite getting rid of all of the years before 1950, it's still a very unsettled signal for these Septembers overall, with low pressure driving in from off the Atlantic. We do see some higher pressure to our south, but overall this is an unsettled and quite wet signal for these Septembers. Bear in mind there will be years there that deviate. For example, we've got 1991 there, which was a warm, dry September, and also 1985 as well. So we have got years within that deviate, but putting all of the years together, all Septembers combined post 1950, following a June England and Wales rainfall range of 86 to 110 millimetres. It's a wet and unsettled low pressure dominated signal. Very different for October though. All Octobers combined post 1950 builds high pressure over and to the east of the coast. So a much more anticyclonic signal there for the all Octobers combined post 1950. Not as cold either. That will be bringing up wind from more of a southerly direction. So quite a warm, dry signal for those Octobers after a cool, wet signal for September. And then all Novembers combined post 1950 looking like this, with lower pressure then to our south, higher pressure in the middle of the Atlantic, so a bit of mid-Atlantic ridge, some lower pressure up towards Greenland, the Flamijet, just something a little bit like that. So somewhere in between a rather cool and unsettled signal and a drier signal. The Atlantic is blocked off, so it's nowhere near as unsettled as September, for example. And could be a little bit on the cool side as well, with winds tending to come in from the northwest. And then finally, all autumns combined, following a June England and Wales precipitation range of 86 to 110 millimetres post 1950, looks like this. Unsettled, but bear in mind a lot of that is down to September. A lot of that is going to be down to the wet September signal, because October is much more anticyclonic, and November, to be honest, isn't overly unsettled either. Nevertheless, it's still a bit low pressure dominating, with winds coming in from the west. Not a particularly cold signal, just rather unsettled, and that's particularly so in September. Okay, that's it then for the fourth autumn update. So I hope you found it interesting and informative. Please give us a like on the video. If you enjoyed it, let us know in the comments what you think. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And as I say, we're going to be releasing the GWV Autumn 2020 forecast on the 30th of August. This video will be placed on the Autumn Updates page at GavsWeatherVids later on this afternoon or early on this evening, and I'll get that up for you sometime today. We're going to have GavsWeatherVids Sunday Roundup coming up after lunch, or around or just after lunch, and then we're going to be live streaming from 6, and in that live stream we are going to have a look at the towel paints and logs for the winter of 2021. It's going to be a very, very interesting and eagerly awaited live stream at 6 o'clock on GavsWeatherVids YouTube channel and across all of GavsWeatherVids platforms. I'm taking the next few days off, so there's not going to be an autumn update next Sunday. So the next autumn update, the fifth autumn update, will be with you in a couple of weeks' time. But for this autumn update, that's all for now, and thanks for watching.